American arcades were already on their way out in the early 2000s. Once, they'd been the place to go to experience the true versions of games like Street Fighter II and Mortal Kombat, but technology was reaching a point where the home console ports of these games were just as good as their arcade counterparts. Some of the most exciting arcade games then were the ones that you couldn't easily reproduce at home. Elaborate contraptions like Namco's Alpine Surfer, Digital Fusion's Beachhead 2000, and Konami's Silent Scope 2 drew in players at malls, movie theaters, and bowling alleys with gimmicks that couldn't easily be matched by home hardware. And perhaps no game of this era was as immediately striking, intriguing, or captivating as Dance Dance Revolution. First released in Japanese arcades in 1998, Dance Dance Revolution began life as the second franchise in Konami's Bemani music game series after the DJ Sim Beatmania. The gameplay is easy enough to understand, simply step on each of the 4 arrows in time with the beats on screen. But it's hard to master, requiring not just coordination and stamina, but the ability to read increasingly complex step patterns. The game's soundtrack was mainly sourced from the Dance Mania series of remix albums, which had popularized Eurodance in Japan in the late 1990s, along with some original tracks by Konami's in-house composer, Naoki Maeda. DDR was an immediate hit. It had sold over 10,000 arcade cabinets by 1999, and Konami followed up with sequels, console ports with plastic home dance pads, and international releases. DDR appeared in US arcades in 1999, though American players didn't get a home console version until 2001. I first played DDR not at an arcade, but at a friend's house. He'd gotten into buying imported, burned PlayStation games from shady guys on Craigslist, and alongside some Japan-exclusive anime titles, he also got a copy of Dance Dance Revolution 3rd Mix. We played it at his place using regular controllers and eventually a plastic dance pad he got on eBay. The high-energy music of the game captivated me. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. We immediately wanted to know where we could find an arcade cabinet to try the real thing, but this was the early 2000s. Most arcades didn't have websites, and smartphones and Google Maps didn't exist yet. So we went poking around online and ended up at a site called DDR Freak. Launched by Northern Californian players in March of 2000, DDR Freak was originally intended as a way to organize the local San Francisco Bay Area community that was building up around the game. First hosted on a UC Berkeley server, the site began to rack up traffic from around the country and eventually became the go-to site for American DDR players. DDR Freak had everything you might want to know about the game. Song listings by release, step charts to mentally practice your moves, guides, reviews, and more. But it wasn't just the kind of information you'd find on any game site of the time. Because DDR was a game played with specific hardware in social settings, you could learn how to organize tournaments, how to import games and peripherals from sites like Lixan, and even how to advocate for the maintenance of machines and communicate effectively with arcade staff and technicians. Most importantly, though, DDR Freak had machine location listings and forums where players discussed the games and planned meetups. Using information gleaned from the site, my friend and I made a pilgrimage to Pacific Mall, the largest indoor Asian shopping mall in North America and a destination for weebs at the time. With a printed out map and our pockets full of quarters, we took a commuter bus, 2 trains, and a city bus to finally arrive at an arcade filled with over-the-top machines. Initial D, pop-in music, Fist of the North Star, and of course, DDR. It was sensory overload, and I was hooked. From then on, we made regular weekend trips to other locations discovered through the DDR Freak listings. A holdout arcade in a dying downtown core mall, the student center at a nearby university, and so on. Each of these settings had its quirks. Different versions of the game, different crowds, different rules. In the back room of the student center with a DDR machine crammed next to a Drum Mania cabinet, you could get away with all kinds of stuff. But in a mall arcade patrolled by attendants, you'd get a stern talking to for something like jumping over the bar, a common way to show off among players at the time. Arcades were weirdly equalizing spaces. You might think the opposite because of how they required that you pay to play games, but in practice, social norms trumped pocket change. You couldn't just keep pumping quarters into most machines. Instead, you were expected to take turns in accordance with the individual arcade's unspoken rules. For DDR, this usually meant placing a quarter or token just below the screen to indicate that you were next. On busy days, it didn't matter how much cash you had, you couldn't play more than anyone else. It wasn't perfect, and there were always people who wouldn't play along with the vibes, but generally speaking, it was a lot harder to be an asshole in an arcade than it was and is online, simply because you were in the same room as the people you might be antagonizing. The physicality of the arcade did mean that things like race and sex came into the picture, but maybe because of its unconventional premise, DDR tended to transcend these boundaries. Crowds of DDR players were diverse racial and gender mixes of all kinds of 2000s archetypes: b-boys, weebs, preps, goths, losers, and cool kids. We were united in our love of a game that was still seen as a little weird by American culture at large, a niche of a still niche hobby. And we shared that love in person as well as online. It was the dawn of the new millennium, and we were figuring out how the increasingly complex and accessible online world would interface with what we had known up to that point as reality. DDR Freak was one of my first experiences with the internet crossing over into the field of real life. Nowadays, that distinction doesn't make a lot of sense, but back then, the internet was still pretty uncharted territory. You chatted with your friends via instant messenger or email, but most of the people you were communicating with on forums or chat rooms were total strangers. And like with any new technology, moral panic surrounded the internet at this relatively early stage, with cautionary tales of kids captured by duplicitous adults being commonplace. It was like old fairy tales. Don't go into the forest alone, or who knows what'll happen to you. This was not only pre-MySpace and pre-Facebook, it was before digital cameras were mainstream. You didn't meet up with strangers from the internet who, after all, could be literally anyone hiding behind an anonymous avatar and username. We were convinced, or at least our parents were, that using our actual names or photos online would inevitably lead to death or dismemberment at the hands of faceless predators. So on gaming forums like GameFAQs, there was rarely any expectation that users would ever meet in person. That feeling of anonymity meant that there were no real repercussions for negative behavior, aside from the possibility of getting banned. But the fact that DDR was played primarily in the public space of the arcade meant that there was always the chance of running into someone local from the forums, which changed the tenor of online communications about the game. The internet kept growing throughout the 2000s, and corporate interests began to take over functions that had previously been built up in ad hoc ways by users. That meant a greater deal of convenience, but it also meant a loss of control of the web and a decay of communities built around spaces like forums. Simultaneously, the advent of increasingly cheap bandwidth and processing power was driving arcades out of business. Even novel games like DDR couldn't keep American arcades alive forever. Assuming you could afford a home computer or console, there was less and less reason to deal with the hassle of traveling to an arcade and waiting your turn to play a game. Both of these changes made new experiences possible and brought us different ways to interact with other people around the world. But there was also something lost in the death of arcades and the decline of forums like DDR Freak. These spaces encouraged a kind of social mixing that's more and more absent from our online and offline lives. Even as online activity has consolidated into a few big websites that everyone uses, the algorithm and ad-driven corporate internet makes it easier than ever to live in a bubble. At the same time, online multiplayer games still struggle with the vicious atmospheres created in part by the facelessness of other players. DDR was an anomaly. It was a game that drew people together, one that people built hybrid online-offline communities around. In some ways, it anticipated the future of gaming and the internet. But it was different in important ways too. For many people today, the internet is an omnipresent plane overlaid onto the real world. But before smartphones and Wi-Fi made this possible, digital and physical life interacted in more tentative ways. I'm not saying it was better, and in many ways it was less convenient than our current arrangement. But it was another way of intertwining the digital and physical worlds, one less concerned with advertising and clout, and more concerned with coordinating communities across time and space. DDR Freak finally shut down in 2011, having been in service for 11 years, though the machine listings fell out of date long before that. Still, DDR and music game enthusiasts started other sites to fill the gap. Today, Xenius is a great destination for news, cabinet locations, and information. And of course, DDR is still around, one of the few game franchises Konami still supports. The world is a very different place than it was 20 years ago, but I think it's worth looking back, if only to remember that things could have gone differently and that we can still change things today. That's it for this episode of Forgotten Worlds. If you are a part of a DDR community online, or if there are any other online communities you'd like me to take a look at in a future episode, please let me know in the comments. And until next time, stay safe out there in cyberspace.